books really show us that no matter what we're going through, we're not the first ones, we won't be the last one. And although every story is unique, the threads carry through them all.
Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a physician, mom, coach, author, publisher, and I am passionate about how telling stories helps you reclaim your story and build your most beautiful future. As the author of our own stories, we can be taken aback by unexpected events in our lives. Motherhood and the quest to become a mother can be a journey full of not only hope and love, but also of loss and grief. Our guest today, Dr. Rebecca Thompson, MD, is a family medicine and public health physician out of Portland, Oregon, who specializes in women's and children's health. She is also the author of Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love, a collaboration of stories of women, including Dr. Thompson's own journey. Dr. Thompson and women who are made up of patients, friends, and colleagues share the most vulnerable and intimate details of their lives and their own journeys into motherhood, from pregnancy to adoption and parenting throughout the lifespan, with all of the varied challenges that life can present along the way. Dr. Thompson, thank you so much for being here with us on Talks with Dr. Shafer. What inspired you to share your story and the stories of 21 other women and their motherhood journeys through your book, Held Together?
Thanks for having me. I've been really looking forward to this and grateful to connect with you online among so many other mutual connections that we share. I think the biggest thing that motivates me is sharing the extraordinary moments from ordinary lives. So, stepping back a little bit in the origin story of Held Together, when my husband and I were thinking about starting a family, it was just as I was finishing up my first residency. There'll be a second. That's a little bit of a spoiler, but I suddenly became a patient from all sorts of complications in trying to get pregnant, losing pregnancies, continuing with pregnancies that became complicated. I saw a whole new side of medicine. And I wanted to bring what I'd learned back to help others, both in my clinical care, hence the second residency and specializing more in women's and children's health, and in gathering up the stories that I was hearing to make something bigger out of these individual struggles, and to find the really uplifting and optimistic sides of even the hardest experiences without being naive about it. So that was the motivation.
When did you decide to write these stories down? Because, I think those of us that have gone through traumatic experiences, whether it's relating to motherhood or relating to other things that could be shared with you, such as residency, medical training, right? There's a lot of challenges that go along with all of those experiences. It's hard enough to even get to the place where we're willing to think about some of these things,
absolutely.
let alone write them down, and then take the leap from writing them down to sharing them, whether it's even having a close friend or colleague read them, to then sharing them with the world and getting stories from others. So how did that evolve into the book that you have now?
I think evolve is just the right word. And thank you for highlighting that, because it was a long process that had to unfold in its own way. The book itself, I spent about a decade collaborating with these women to write, just over 10 years from when I started until when it was published last April. Originally, when I was thinking about wanting to write something to sort of give back to the community, as I was in one of my early attending jobs, and I had a little bit of free time to carve out truly these little stolen moments in between activities and at car pickup for kids, preschool drop-off lines and things. But what could I put together? What could I put out into the world? And initially I thought about something more instructional, like an infant feeding guide or early support, for families. And I started thinking I should collect some vignettes to illustrate the story, to illustrate the points, because vignettes are so compelling. But what I found is that not only were they so compelling, I couldn't look away from the vignettes. It's all I wanted to think about were the stories that illustrated the principles. And I didn't really want to write a book that told people what to do. So that was back in, well, July of 2014 is when I first started thinking about writing this and starting to talk to a few of the women who ended up in the book. The complications that we talk about had mostly been happening in 2007, 2008. My son was born in 2009 and my daughter in 2011. So if that gives you a sense of, like you said, like you implied, we can't always figure things out when we're living them, right? So it took several more years of processing things, getting to, what you might think of as the other side of things. Spoiler, there's no other side. We're always still living it, right? But I'd gotten through some of those biggest experiences and I was ready to figure out what to do with them. So 2014 is when I first started talking to these women, interviewing them, transcribing their stories, and then working with them, each one collaboratively, to shape her narrative into that most compelling version of her story that we could together.
And I've heard you speak on this in another interview, and I loved how you focused on what I understand when you were gathering the data, both from yourself and from the other beautiful women who contributed to the book, Held Together, was you encouraged everyone, yourself included, to share their story in the least filtered, most
Yes.
authentic and vulnerable form, with the reassurance that, this isn't necessarily what we're going to share, but I want you to share it. And then we will work on how you want to communicate it.
Yes.
I'm curious, as you did that, were you surprised at, once that dam was broken and the experience and the emotions came out, that perhaps there was some shame or fear in sharing before this invitation? Were you surprised at all by how much contributors decided to keep in the stories, how much they wanted to share once they felt free to share the story to begin with?
Yeah. A couple levels of surprise. Even women that I thought I knew well and probably did know pretty well before this experience, the level of exploration of these stories, of what they were able to tap into and willing to share, that always surprised me. But the details themselves, too. Like, I thought I knew a good amount of their story. I had invited them to be part of this because I knew something about their story, right? And just as a side note, all of the stories are from people that I did know and just invited in, or, had known for decades or worked with recently or had a patient in my care. And so I knew them in different contexts, but nobody was just recruited because her story fit a niche, some kind of a theme we wanted to cover. These are just ordinary people in my life. So not only was I surprised by how willing people were to share, but it was such a good reminder that you never really know what people are living and what meaning they are taking and trying to create from what they're experiencing. It was really astounding. Even though I thought I knew going in to some degree, I thought I was sensitive to that idea. And I think maybe I was more than average, but it's still really humbling.
Yeah, I think as doctors, we are gifted with something really special and being able to bond and connect with our patients through them sharing things with us as a part of the interview process and care process that they don't necessarily share with other people. But even then, we know, in our training, we learn that we have to understand that what we are receiving is filtered, right? And we may
Sure.
not be at a place with a patient where they're ready to share their story. It doesn't mean anything other than they're a human.
And we don't have time in those constraints.
It's so true.
That's the biggest factor. That I think is what was really special about this, is that we carved out that time and we protected that time. And that allowed me to say to them, as you mentioned, like, please share the most honest version of your story that you can. We're blocking out these really 2-3 hours at a time for a walk or a phone call or visiting over coffee, whatever it might be, depending on where she lives in relation to, if we can get together in person or not. We protected that time. It's just not something that we get in medicine. It's such a privilege to be able to do that and to dig deeper into those stories. And so to say to her, share anything you can, anything you want to, try to reserve your own judgment, and then together we will figure out what makes the most sense to share, how to shape your story, and telling her, reassuring her that she always had control of that until it was, off with the publisher and out of either of our control. I told everybody, and I would work with them and advise them, and like, I really think we should leave this in, or if we take that out, that makes sense to me because of this. I would try to give that perspective of why the story fits into the whole in a certain way and why something was crucial. But I never said no. I would never say no to anything someone wanted to take out. Or honestly, even if she had wanted to pull the story at the last minute, we would have made it work. Everyone had that control, and I kept telling them until the moment that it was out of my control too. And surprisingly, I mean, there wasn't much that people pulled there. I can think of a few lines here and there of, I think we shouldn't say it this way because that might hurt the feelings of my, spouse, child, parent. Honestly, even exes and people that are not necessarily always painted in the best light, we tried to be really kind and not, we tried to be as kind as possible and assume best intentions, but show the perspective of the woman whose story we were representing, first and foremost.
Yeah, that's so important and so powerful and respectful. And that's all very important in the storytelling process. Now, as someone who is obviously a born storyteller, who has curiosity about other people's stories, which can be quite rare, and it's such a beautiful quality to have. As you were also trained as a physician, not only in bedside manner as a family medicine physician, which is such a caring position, an all-encompassing caring person in someone's life journey and their family's life journey often, but then the added layer of being in public health as well. So taking all of that into consideration, yourself, who you've really trained yourself and are likely just naturally inclined to be open and to listen. When you were going through this process of collecting these stories and telling these stories, were there things that surprised you of the ways that these women or you yourself were inclined to edit or to hold back that needed to be overcome to tell these stories authentically?
I think that one of the hardest things to see in ourselves, I don't know about overcoming per se, but recognizing, the thing that comes to my mind is growth, this growth and change, especially around grief. It's really hard to reflect on and to understand the ways that we are changing. I wonder if it's hesitancy, reluctance to talk about it, as you're asking, or to some degree, but also just we're so close to these stories as one person, right? I think that I would find myself wanting to dig deeper with my questions in trying to help people explore how they had changed, for better and for worse, but how these experiences had impacted them. I feel like it makes me think about also, you had an episode where you were talking about music theory and the influence of music with Bridget, right?
Yes.
Each time we hear a song, we're a different person, right? So the song speaks to us differently. You bring new experiences, new learnings, and new grief, right? So the song has a different meaning to offer you at that moment. It's like that with story too. And I find that when I'm working with these women, they have an interpretation, subconscious or articulated, about what had happened and why and what it meant now. But even just the action of listening to them, let them tap in more to other things that their story could mean. And every time, and for all of these women, I should say, each individual woman, we had several too many meetings in going over ideas for her story and collaborating and iterating the story. Here's what I've got from what you said so far. What did I get wrong? What can we expand on? Could you talk more about this? Every time we'd revisit it, there was a new perspective from both of us. We'd each had new experiences. And I think that stories, they show us change, and that's what's so powerful, is we witness each woman's growth and change, but we change as readers too. So every time we come back, there's something different that we bring to the story and that we take from the story.
That's a beautiful point to make. And I think, especially on the motherhood journey, and you and I were speaking off camera about this before we started recording, about, the ages of my children, the ages of your children, and how our perception changes, not only of them as growing humans, of ourselves, and also potentially of our experience and our caregivers, and how that dynamic is affecting our daily
Mm-hmm.
decisions and maybe our ability to be vulnerable, the relationship we have to our stories, how big a part shame plays in our stories if we were facing challenges and we may have been holding ourselves to unreasonable standards. And that makes me think about, for our listeners who are involved in healthcare and are also on a parenting journey of their own, however that takes shape as you talk about the diversity of that journey in your book.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think it's so important, and I appreciate how you touch on this with your own experiences, that we allow ourselves, even as we are in healthcare, to be humans
Mm-hmm.
first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a strong inclination
Yeah.
to expect from ourselves to somehow be clinical in the way we approach our own health and our own life experiences, but we wouldn't expect that from our patients. We understand our patients deserve to hold that boundary. They get to be human first and to be cared for when they come to us and get our clinical support, but we don't always give ourselves that same grace and allowance to be human. And I think that can have negative consequences for us. As you navigate, I know a lot of your stories are from colleagues, and your own story as a female physician. Did that play out in your story? Were there times when you had to break some conditioning of expectations that were maybe had evolved as a part of your training as a physician, this kind of
Mm-hmm.
push through it, know everything, fix everything, don't bother anyone approach that we often have as female physicians?
Oh, so many layers to that question. Yeah, about half of the 22 of us, I think it is exactly 11, are healthcare professionals of some kind. So everything from different kinds of physicians, family medicine, peds, um, pathology, geriatrics, wide range. We also have massage therapy, psychologist. We have partners of the storytellers who are in medical specialties too. So there's a lot of perspective of, all of a sudden it's me. Something has changed. And personally, for me, I feel like a couple of things that it impacted because of being a clinician. Like you said, we're conditioned not to want to feel vulnerable necessarily, uh, not to question what we're going through, and just kind of walk the path we've been taught. And shame can fill a role, or play a role in that, because of this sense of failure. Like, we're defining it as a failure. We're used to succeeding, and we just define medical complications that aren't our health being perfectly fine as a failure. But I think one thing I realized in this process of taking in these stories and exploring my own is that shame and pity they're different, but they're very closely related. And to me, I don't think that shame was really playing a role in not wanting to talk about my experience. I never I don't think felt really ashamed. These things felt totally out of my control, but I didn't want to be an object of pity. That's the sense of feeling like being seen as weak or not able to handle what happens. Not that I had to control what happened, but that I should be able to respond to it and make something positive of it. I mean, ultimately, that's what I tried to do with writing this book, and I think that can be great, but it can take time, and we need to be patient and allow ourselves that grace that we can't always make it all make sense in the moment, and if not accept being somewhat pitied for what's happening, at least accepting help to heal from what's happening and distinguish between those ideas.
I call that often the messy middle, and I think about that as a
Mm-hmm.
time of
Yep.
growth, and more of a like soil, preparing the soil for growth.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we're growing something really important that is a long-term investment, we got to start from the very beginning. And it brings me to a scene in your book where you talk about planting kiwi.
Mm-hmm.
And reflecting on where you were on your parenting journey. And it struck me personally because I can remember when I had a miscarriage. I had my daughter, who was 4 at the time, with me, and I was trying to get help from our childcare provider at the time, who wasn't expecting to care for her that day and could not.
Mm-hmm.
So I was having a miscarriage, and I became very, I felt very unwell, very lightheaded. I did not feel well, and I couldn't get anyone to help me. I did get to the hospital with my daughter. And so here I am there with my daughter in the room with me while they're doing, because it was an early stage of pregnancy,
Yeah.
they're doing the probe to do,
Mm-hmm.
the ultrasound, and they're finding, that I am actively miscarrying. And that day I went home, and the place that I went to, the only place that I could go with my daughter, was actually into our little garden plot and just till the soil. And I remember I hadn't thought of that for years until
Oh,
I
wow.
was listening to you planting, your story of you planting. And I was thinking, gosh, that's where I went to with my daughter, because I couldn't think of what else to do in that time than to spend that time with her, preparing the soil for the fruits and vegetables that many, many months later, we as a family
Yep.
would harvest together. And so I found so much beauty in the way you shared that, and hope, even as you're sharing a moment of intense grief.
Thank you. And wow, I'm sorry you had to go through all that too. That's a lot to have your daughter with you too and everything. Yeah, I remember, and I talk about this in that scene in the book. And there are many scenes with the kiwi arbor that we're constructing, but that initial scene of creating it and feeling like I just wanted to do something that felt productive and optimistic, forward thinking, just like you're saying, ready the soil, ready the space, prepare the ground, and then knowing, having the trust that something else will come, something else will grow there, where we're removing the ground to make room for something better.
When I think about finding hope in those moments and thinking about how you shared your story and other women shared their stories of loss, and how they were impacted by how they were impacted by the clinicians that they intersected with in these pivotal moments of their lives, and how that impacted them. Words are so incredibly important in our lives, and as physicians, the words that we share can have a lot of weight, especially as patients
Mm-hmm.
are traversing these really challenging moments. We weren't necessarily trained, many of us, in how to provide that support in an empathic and connecting way. We were taught what the problem is, what we need to document, what we need to tell
Right.
them, and what the next best steps are, if there are those to be shared. So were there times in your experience as a physician where you felt confronted with this lack of training from the healthcare professionals that you are coming into contact with, and opportunities for growth or ways that you would like to share these experiences or the experiences of other people in the book to help educate us so that we do the best we can. We show up a bit more empowered to navigate those conversations with grace and in a truly supportive way.
Mm. Yeah, what an important and beautiful question. Thank you. I think that the reason that I'm drawn to trying to tell stories like this and listening to stories like this is that my background was not originally in medicine. I didn't set out planning to be a doctor. I set out planning to be an archaeologist. So my background is in anthropology. And my favorite courses in college and things to think about were all around life stories. So it all makes sense in retrospect, right? It all fits together about why I would want to tell these kinds of stories for people, with people, and on their behalves, and help preserve their voices and lift up their voices. But I think so much of the limitation does come down to time, even if a clinician wants to be really sensitive about how they're, say, presenting difficult news or listening to a patient's history to try to figure out the diagnosis. It's so difficult right now in our current medical system and just in our society. It's not just medicine. Everything is so fast and relentless. So I guess I think that's why just having stories like the ones in Held Together out in the world can be impactful, because the more people who read stories like this and understand the nuance behind what their patients might be sharing, the limits of what they're sharing, and what might lie beneath it, even if you're in a 5 or 10-minute encounter as a clinician with your patient, you really can bring, again, what you bring to the story. You can bring to that person's story a lot more depth and a lot more sensitivity and a lot more understanding of maybe what they're not saying to you. And while you can't expand and compress time, you really can use your time differently in a way that can let the person you're trying to help feel more heard, which will ultimately lead to better care, not just for the kind of psychological aspects of feeling heard, but that you can logistically figure out better what's happening with them. So thinking about stories, even in the time constraints that you might have, it really does add a new level of being able to communicate and, more importantly, to listen.
And I think also to understand goals as well, I think is really important. And you have to understand someone's motivations, right? To
Mm-hmm.
create a real care plan, you have to understand so much about a person. If it's not a really simple issue, like,
Yeah.
hey, doc, I've
Yeah.
got this thing here. I don't want it here. What's
Nothing
the
is
plan?
simple. I mean, nothing is simple, because they're also worried about if it's cancer, and because their family member or their friend, something bad just happened, or disfigurement because of they they have some event they're about to go to and they don't want a scar here, or like whatever it might be. There's always a layer. There's so much more context. Yeah. And we can't know all of it, but we can at least understand that it's there, even if we don't know the specifics in every case and have time to hear all the specifics about it.
And when for me, when I look back at some interactions that didn't go the way I expected, I think those were missed opportunities for understanding the story and for asking curious questions. And when we lack context, we create context,
Yeah.
and it's
Yes.
usually based, it's usually sourced from our life experiences. And the thing is, when doctors don't have context, they're just as inclined to do that as someone else because they have human brains. They're very well trained in data collection and
Yeah.
exams and what's the
Yeah.
right test and how do I do this procedure and all these things, but they're still humans. And so if you're
Yeah.
one thing that I find really interesting is if you're feeling those very human emotions coming up in your interactions with people, taking a moment to think, what is this bringing up in me and what do I need
Mhm.
to investigate so that I make sure that I am having that boundary and I'm using my human experience to empathize with someone, but I'm also not projecting onto them and I'm giving them space for their story so that at the end of the day, we're not saying, oh, this is what happened. Isn't it what you wanted to happen? And then because I learn what their story is, I realize, oh, that's not at all what you wanted to come of
Right.
your care.
Right. Oh, this makes me think so much too of your conversation about voice with Matt about from Sticky Notes, right?
Yeah.
So he was talking about how um, he used third person because he wanted to kind of remove himself from the story, and I thought, well, that's fascinating because I used first person voice to remove myself from the story. And what I mean by that is I used the first person voice of each of these women, right? So almost all I can think of my favorite nonfiction books by other physician authors, like memoirs, essay collections, they're all written in first person about the doctors or the healthcare professionals' experience, and their patients' experiences are in third person, right? And
Mm.
they write beautiful explorations of what they think their patient was experiencing, what they know about their patient's context and backstory. I love so many. This is what brought me to narrative medicine. I love these books. These are I read, as an anthropology student too, medical anthropology, social anthropology, all of these ideas. But I felt like there's something missing from that, right? I haven't found other writings where a physician with that perspective and understanding what her patient's stories could mean medically, socially, from all the angles, has collaborated with her patients and her medical colleagues and friends in the community to capture those stories, but preserve that person's voice. So it was really important to me. I never considered writing this in third person, describing my patients' experiences. It was always the intent to help capture each person's perspective on her own story. But I also didn't want it to be an anthology, right? I didn't want her to just hand me a story and then I maybe rework it a little bit. It really had to be a collaborative effort. And I think that's what's so unusual about this book and these kinds of stories, and what was so rewarding to me about doing it is to really, really amplify and refine and offer these voices back from people we don't usually hear from.
Yeah, absolutely. It brought up for me even Grey's Anatomy. Everyone loves Grey's Anatomy. Many of us watched it in the early days of our training, and quickly learned that there was, they maybe needed a little more medical consultation
Yeah,
for some of their
right.
props, et cetera. And it was not anything near my experience of training, but it was very, salacious in a sense because it was from the perspective of these
Right,
doctors and their personal lives. It was all amped up for the show.
right.
Um, but the people we fell in love with, truly, the reason we loved the main characters was their interactions with the stories of people that came into their lives for brief moments
Mhm.
often.
Yes.
That's why we connected with these people. And so I think that's such a beautiful way to share your own story by shining the light on people in your life. Like you said, it's not random people, it's people in your life,
Yeah.
and the diversity of those stories. And I think it's a good lesson in general for community building. And when we're feeling isolated and alone and stuck in our stories and our grief
Mhm.
feels overwhelming, how can we shine a light on others
Mhm.
and create a community? And so I wanted to ask you, having done this, gone about this process over a decade of time, How have you found opportunities to build community and find safe spaces to share about motherhood? And are there things we can share with listeners who maybe can't think of 21 people in their lives and can't think of someone that they can reach out to, and they're feeling really alone during a loss or in the peripartum period?
Well, I think that all of the connections that this book came from and that I try to foster in my life now, it starts with one person. It doesn't really work to just say, I need a community. It doesn't work like that. It's one person at a time reaching out to one other person. At least that's the kind of community that I'm building. There are many ways to go about this, right? But I think of, even just since this book came out, the most gratifying thing one of the most gratifying things has been to hear from individuals, whether that's one of the collaborators and how, it's impacted her life to have it out there in the world and opened up conversations with her friends and family about her story that she hadn't had before, or a reader who found it because of someone telling her about it or just stumbling across it, in a bookstore, hearing from those individuals. And then so now it's been out there for many months, and I've started to get second, third, fourth effects on that, where one person told one other person, and she told one other person, and then that third or fourth person comes back to me and messages me and says, I can't believe this found me at just this moment. And I think that's community, right? So we don't need, like a big project like this, we don't need to do it all at once. We can't do it all at once. We have to see how it unfolds. And, I hope everybody has even one person who they feel like they can trust. They don't have to have had the same experience as you. That's something else I want to highlight. If you have someone in your life who is just a good listener or a willing listener, or, able to meet up with you, whether on the phone or in person, and you feel like he or she would listen to you and you want to listen to that person too, start there. One thing that collecting these stories, writing these stories together with these women taught me, maybe because of my public health roots, is about the patterns, right? The stories change. The details are always different, but we see the threads, we see the patterns, we see the commonalities. And all this to say, you don't have to have someone in your current network, in your community, among your friends, who's been through the same thing you're going through, because the odds are a person who wants to listen to you is going to have something they can bring to the table, they can bring to understand your experience, because no matter what the cause of the things that you're grappling with, the struggles are universal.
I so appreciate you sharing that. And I'm thinking back, as our readers now, I hope, will go and get the book and read it and reflect on family, parenthood, community, connection. I think we are living in a day and age where we are yearning for connection. And I think the stories of many of these women in this book, they were going through this journey in a different era, even though it wasn't that many years ago. It was a
But it was a lifetime
completely,
ago. For
yeah, it
all
was
of
a
us, so many
lifetime.
lifetimes ago. Yep.
Yeah, it's a different era. The way we
Yeah.
connect is different, and the
Yeah.
level of isolation is quite different for many of us. Even though we are so connected in so many ways, we're also so disconnected in many ways, especially with all the after effects of what happened with COVID. We as communities have lost so much, but I love your emphasis on building a community is as simple and difficult as reaching out
Mhm.
to one person and showing up vulnerably with your story, but also showing up with curiosity and
Yes.
care for theirs. And that is a challenge for the time that I think if we all took that upon us, that every week I'm going to commit to doing this in one forum or other, what kind of communities could we build and look back a year from now or 10 years from now, as you mentioned, this was a 10-year
Yeah.
project, and
Yeah.
see how we tilled that soil, we planted those seeds, and what were we able to grow together.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think curiosity, as I've said many times in talking about this book, curiosity is the foundation for compassion. And I think now more than ever, with the, as you said, the different ways that we communicate and network and come together and build community, I think this is so important that we talk about our imperfections. That's what really brings us into community, is showing those vulnerabilities and just being more real. We've moved, I think, a little bit out of the everything having to be polished on social media and those kinds of sharing forums. I think some people have shifted into like, this is really what's happening. But even the so-called real is curated on that kind of that kind of a platform. So how can you show up imperfectly but genuinely with individuals around you? I think that's how we can all find comfort in each other's stories.
Mm. It's a beautiful invitation. And it's okay to listen to your nervous system when it tells you, this isn't the way I want to show up. Just like you said.
Yeah.
And I really loved how you shared that about your writing journey, how you started in one place with one intention,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
because you were curious not only about
Mm-hmm.
wanting to go on the journey, but curious and allowing it to evolve as to what is the
Yeah.
story I really want to tell. It's not going to look the same when you're at point A or when you're at B, C, D, and certainly
Mm-hmm.
not at X, Y, and Z. So what a
Yeah.
beautiful thing to communicate and say, that's a normal part of the journey.
Thank you. And I think, that exemplifies, or another one of the messages from these stories is that we need to trust ourselves. The process can be confusing, complicated, make no sense in the moment, but if we can follow our stories, kind of see where they're leading, listen to each other, but also listen to ourselves, that's how we will find that kind of empowerment that complications can take away from us, right? Where we can choose to really make sense of what's happening. Again, not to say it's all going to be good, not to be naive in saying we find something optimistic and hopeful. No, but there is always something we can do. And next step, tending to the soil in a way that looks toward the future. There's always something we can do to tend that soil and to plan for the next steps.
Have your children, who are teenagers now, read the
Mm-hmm.
book? And they have?
Well, my daughter has listened to the whole audiobook. My
Mm.
son has read parts, but not the whole thing, I don't think. But they have their own copies in their rooms on their little bookshelves, and it's fun to talk about it with them. They've been to a bunch of my readings and they've heard some of the podcasts and things too. So I always talk with them about it. They know what's in there. And then they, like every reader, can take and choose what serves them at that phase of their lives. And yeah, I hope that they'll be able to enjoy these stories and learn about, some of the women that they know too in our lives over many years.
I think when I was growing up, it was becoming pretty normal for kids to be educated about their bodies, about
Mm-hmm.
reproduction, that sort of thing. But I can't recall a single time that I was made aware of the realities of childbirth, of pregnancy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the experience, not the data points, but the experience. And I think that is the beauty of storytelling, and why we say that children can open their world when they open a book. When we share
Mm-hmm.
these stories and we demystify it, we empower kids. And so I wanted to bring that up because obviously these stories are very precious and close to your children because they're mother's stories. I also think how important and what a great opportunity to share with young people these experiences so they can reflect back as I've heard you reflect on, our own pregnancy and birth and child rearing stories. They're not in isolation. They exist in the backdrop of everything that we have experienced and our family has experienced and how that's affected our upbringing. And even when we think about human physiology and the fact that the eggs that someone has, right? How long of
Right.
a lineage of existence that they've had preceding the time of your birth.
It's amazing that any of us even exist.
The world is an amazing place, but we are stronger, safer, more empowered when we share these stories. And it comes again back to community when we think about how our strong communities before we taught our history, we taught these lessons of health and safety through storytelling. And I love that as a physician, we're so data driven. That's what we're trained to focus on. When you were thinking what was the best way to share this information, you kept coming back to the best way to communicate was through the vignettes, through the stories. And I think that's a call to action to us as physicians and us as humans to really lean into our stories. And instead of making excuses for all of the little things that make us human, embrace them and live with them and live out our stories without shame, with fewer external expectations, and just with more of a commitment to being true to ourselves, whatever challenge we're facing, and give the same grace to those in our community as well.
I mean, that's the power of books, right? You alluded to what if there's a person out there who feels like she has no one, right? Maybe in that moment in your life, you can't identify someone within your circle that feels like the right person to connect with. Meanwhile, there are always books and stories. There's always the legacy, the history of that. You absolutely are never alone. Nobody is ever alone. You just might not have met the people yet in your real life who will fill that role for you, but the stories are everywhere. And it's not the same as a connection with another human in the moment, right? But it's something and it does matter. And if nothing else, books really show us that no matter what we're going through, we're not the first ones, we won't be the last ones. And although every story is unique, the threads carry through them all.
So beautiful. And it really makes me think about all of the amazing books that were gifted to me by friends and mentors in my residency program when I was going through my first pregnancy and birth of my child and navigating that, and how Held Together is such a beautiful way. If you don't feel you have the words, if you know a friend is going through grief around their journey of motherhood, a book like Held Together can be a beautiful thing to give when you don't have the words to give, when you don't know what to
Thank
do.
you.
We often in grief, we wonder, oh, I don't want to impose. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think beautiful collections of experiences like what you have created with Held Together and what these women have beautifully and vulnerably shared can be a wonderful way to make someone not feel alone in that moment. And it's an invitation for a conversation.
Yes. Invitation.
When they're ready.
Yeah. And especially to your point, when they're ready, I think that one of the best uses, if you will, of these stories is people who have really been through some of these challenges through the lifespan of family relationships and parenthood. We've talked quite a bit just now about our own pregnancy complications, but I want to point out that pregnancy is just the beginning, metaphorically and literally, right? In this book, most of the stories go far beyond fertility and pregnancy complications or stories. These are about the long arc of family life across generations, the relationships that evolve and change. The oldest collaborator is in her mid-70s, and her story covers from when she was a child all the way up until, the book came out, essentially. So these are not just stories to share with someone who's going through pregnancy complications. I hope that it might help someone in that situation, but really, these are stories for people who get it, whether they are a mother, a father, a daughter, a step sibling, a cousin, of, just in complicated relationships, something will resonate. This is not a fertility book. This is not a birth stories book. This is a book about families, very broadly defined, born, built, chosen families.
And our families are the most precious to us, no matter how challenging they are.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter how we've woven them together, and
Right. Here, here.
they deserve the intentionality and the curiosity to keep
Yeah.
learning and figuring out ways to come together.
Well put. Love
And
it.
stay held together, as you
Mm.
mentioned. Now, you are continuing to tour in support of Held Together, and you are also taking part in speaking events. How can our listeners learn how to get involved?
Well, thanks. Everything is on my website, which is just my name, including my middle initial. So RebeccaNThompson.com. No MD, just my name. There's an events page right in the kind of intro page that you come into after you enter the front screen, and it lists everything, all the live events, some past events that have some recordings, all the podcast conversations that I've had, which are so much fun, and different reviews and write-ups in magazines and things like that. It's all on the website. Please, of course, come out and join us for any live events. We've got various parts of the country, but there's always a podcast to choose from. And I try to put a little description with each podcast. You can find one that has a few themes that might resonate with you after you listen to this one. Yeah, and please reach out. There's a connect page on there that just emails me directly as well. One of my biggest goals next, which will speak to you and a lot of your audience, is I really want to get these kinds of stories more into healthcare teaching settings. So I've just started working on developing presentations, often with one or a few of the collaborators from the book as a panel, to talk about our experiences, to read a couple passages, and to address medical students, residents. We'd love to work with nursing programs, psychology training programs, social work, anything that feels relevant, just to get these stories out into the teachings, the curricula of the next generation of healers, and help stories shape how those clinicians listen to their patients and interact with families and understand their own stories when it's their turn to be a patient too.
Absolutely. And I think that's so well said. And I'm a big advocate for including this education and empowerment because just like you said, I think there is a unique vulnerability in healthcare
Mm-hmm.
workers. They've been so focused on
Yeah.
caring very selflessly for others, often for decades, and they can find themselves ill equipped to navigate challenges in their own lives along the spectrum, as you said, from A to Z. So
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
wonderful, not only the resource of the book, but being able to have those conversations and also take the temperature of where are the gaps, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
can we affect positive change
Mm-hmm.
for you and for your patients moving forward. So I think that's so beautiful. And I have to say, I just loved seeing you at KATU on your interview because I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I was sitting on literally in the same little spot on that couch, probably
Oh,
not that long
yay.
before, because I was talking about my book,
Oh, fun.
about a children's book about PDA.
Yeah.
And so again, literature about empowerment, storytelling. It's such an incredible thing that you are sharing. And I'm just so grateful that you came on Talks with Dr. Shafer to share your incredible wisdom and talk about your amazing book.
Thank you for having me. All the best with your writing too, and your daughter's writing. It's great to see all this out in the world.
Thank you so much. And we hope that we've inspired people today to share their stories too.
Please.
We call our audience storytellers because everyone has an incredible story to tell, but you do need to pick up the pen. And we always want to encourage people to really step into living your story authentically and sharing it in your own time in the way you feel comfortable, but learning how to share it and live it for you authentically. Thank you so much for being on the show and for our storytellers for being here. We appreciate your time and we would love to hear your takeaways from this week's show as well. Please share with someone who would love this discussion too. Motherhood connects us all. And if you haven't already, subscribed to Talks with Dr. Shafer, where you enjoy podcasts so you don't miss any of the inspiring episodes coming up on Talks with Dr. Shafer. Until next time, stay safe and take care. I'll talk to you soon.